Nobody was supposed to be in room 214 at 9 o'clock at night, holding the hand of a dying stranger and singing him a lullaby in a voice that cracked with exhaustion, but that is exactly where Margaret Ellery was found, 3 hours after her shift had ended, by a man who would later say that single moment rearranged everything he thought he understood about money, family, and what it truly means to matter to someone. Before we go any further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in second chances, we would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little light today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one are the reason our community exists, and every single one of you who joins us makes it possible for us to keep telling them. Margaret Ellery was 54 years old, though the fine lines etched into the corners of her eyes made her look both older and somehow more alive than most people half her age, as if every hardship she had survived had simply added another layer of quiet strength rather than taking something away. She had been a nurse for 29 years, first in a small rural clinic in Ohio where she grew up patching up farmers' hands and delivering babies in the middle of snowstorms, and later, after her husband Walter passed away from a heart attack that took him in his sleep without so much as a warning, she moved to the city to be closer to her daughter, Claire, and took a position at Fairview Memorial Hospital in the long-term geriatric care wing. It was not a glamorous job. It did not pay particularly well, especially not in a city where rent climbed every year like ivy up the side of a building nobody bothered to trim. But Margaret had never chosen nursing for the money. She had chosen it because, as she used to tell her daughter when Claire was small and asked why mommy came home smelling like antiseptic and sometimes cried quietly in the kitchen after long shifts, somebody has to be there when people are scared, sweetheart. Somebody has to hold the hand nobody else will hold. The man in room 214 was named Harold Whitfield, though for the first several weeks of his stay at Fairview Memorial, almost nobody on the staff knew who he really was. He had been admitted after a fall in his enormous, echoing house on the hill above the city, a house with 14 bedrooms and a view of the entire skyline, a house that had once been full of laughter and dinner parties and the sound of a piano being played badly but enthusiastically by grandchildren who no longer visited. Harold Whitfield had built one of the largest logistics and shipping empires in the country from nothing but a single delivery truck and a stubborn refusal to accept failure, and by the time he turned 81, his name appeared on the covers of business magazines and his net worth was estimated, by those who like to estimate such things, at just under $4 billion. But none of that mattered in room 214, where Harold Whitfield lay small and frail beneath a thin hospital blanket, his once booming voice reduced to a papery whisper, his hands, which had once signed contracts that reshaped entire industries, now trembling too badly to hold a spoon of pudding without spilling it down his chin. He had a grandson. His name was Nathaniel Whitfield, and he was 36 years old, and he had inherited not only his grandfather's sharp jawline and pale gray eyes but also, people whispered, a considerable portion of the old man's ruthlessness, though without quite the same warmth that had once balanced it out. Nathaniel ran the company now, or at least the parts of it that mattered, the parts that generated headlines and stock movements and quarterly earnings calls that made analysts nod approvingly. He wore suits that cost more than Margaret Ellery made in 2 months, and he moved through the world with the particular brand of confidence that comes from never once, in his entire adult life, having to wonder whether the lights would stay on or whether there would be food on the table. He was not, by any account, a cruel man. He simply had never learned to be a present one. His grandfather had raised him, in a manner of speaking, after Nathaniel's parents died in a car accident when he was 9 years old, but raised is a generous word for what actually happened, which was that a rotating cast of nannies, tutors, and household staff attended to Nathaniel's daily needs while Harold Whitfield built his empire, occasionally appearing at breakfast to ask about grades and occasionally missing entire birthdays because a shipment had been delayed in the Pacific and someone needed to make angry phone calls until it wasn't delayed anymore. So it was, perhaps, not entirely surprising that when Harold Whitfield fell in his kitchen one Tuesday morning, reaching for a glass on a shelf just slightly too high, and lay there for 6 hours before the housekeeper found him, Nathaniel's first response was not panic or grief but a kind of cold, efficient management of the situation. He arranged for the best doctors. He arranged for a private room. He had his assistant send flowers, the kind of enormous, professionally arranged bouquets that look beautiful in a hospital room for exactly 1 day before beginning to wilt, unnoticed, in the corner. And then he went back to work, because there was a merger closing at the end of the month, and because, if he was honest with himself in the rare quiet moments when honesty crept up on him, he did not entirely know what to say to a grandfather who had never quite known what to say to him either. Margaret Ellery had been assigned to Harold Whitfield's case during her 4th week on the geriatric wing, and from the very first day, something about the old man's eyes caught her attention. They were the eyes of a person who had spent his entire life being needed by everyone and understood by almost no one, and Margaret, who had spent nearly 3 decades learning to read the things patients could not say out loud, recognized that particular kind of loneliness the way a sailor recognizes a coming storm. She began, without quite deciding to, spending a little more time in room 214 than her round strictly required. She learned that Harold liked his tea with exactly 1 sugar, not 2, despite what his chart said. She learned that he had once, decades ago, built a treehouse for a son who had grown up and moved to Portland and now called perhaps twice a year. She learned that his favorite song was an old jazz standard from the 1950s, something his late wife used to hum while she gardened, and that when Margaret quietly asked her phone to play it one afternoon while she changed his 4-bag, tears slid down the old man's weathered cheeks before he could stop them, and he told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, that nobody had thought to play him music in over a year. It became, over the following weeks, a kind of ritual that Margaret never announced to anyone and never put in her official notes, because she suspected, correctly, that the hospital administration would frown upon a nurse spending unpaid, unofficial hours with a single patient when there were 40 other patients on the wing who also needed care. But there was something about Harold Whitfield's particular loneliness that Margaret could not simply clock out and leave behind at the end of her shift. She would finish her paperwork, hang her badge on its lanyard, and instead of walking to her car in the parking garage, she would slip quietly back down the hallway to room 214, where she would sit in the vinyl chair beside his bed, sometimes reading to him from whatever paperback she had in her bag, sometimes simply holding his hand while he drifted in and out of a thin, uneasy sleep, sometimes singing to him softly when the pain medication made him restless and the old jazz song was the only thing that seemed to settle him. She never told her daughter Claire about these extra hours, not because she was hiding anything shameful but because she knew, with the practical wisdom of a mother who had raised a child mostly alone, that Claire would worry about the toll it was taking, would remind her mother that she was 54 years old and could not keep working a full shift and then staying 3 more hours for free, that her own knees ached, that her own small apartment sat empty and quiet every single night while she gave her evenings away to a stranger's father. And Claire would not have been wrong to worry. Margaret came home most nights bone-tired, her feet throbbing, her back protesting every step, and she would sit alone at her small kitchen table eating a reheated dinner and wonder, sometimes, whether she was foolish for giving so much of herself away to people who could never repay her. But then she would remember the way Harold Whitfield's trembling hand had gripped hers a little tighter when the old jazz song began to play, the way his eyes had softened, just for a moment, from the haunted, hollow look of a man waiting to die alone into something almost like peace, and she would think, as she always thought, that this was precisely why she had become a nurse in the first place. Not for the paycheck. Not for the recognition. But for exactly this. For the holding of a hand that nobody else was holding. It was on a Thursday evening, nearly 2 months into Harold Whitfield's stay, that everything changed, though of course Margaret had no idea, as she settled into the vinyl chair beside his bed after her shift had officially ended, that anyone besides the two of them would ever know what happened in that room that night. Nathaniel Whitfield had flown back into the city that afternoon after a week in Singapore closing the merger that had consumed his every waking hour, and though he told himself he was simply stopping by the hospital out of obligation, some small, buried part of him, the part that still remembered being 9 years old and terrified in a house too big and too quiet, wanted to see his grandfather with his own eyes and confirm that the old man was still, despite everything, still there. He arrived at Fairview Memorial a little after 9 in the evening, well past the posted visiting hours, but a security guard who recognized the Whitfield name from the enormous donor plaque in the hospital lobby waved him through without argument. Nathaniel walked down the quiet, dimly lit hallway of the geriatric wing, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the linoleum, and he was perhaps 10 feet from the door of room 214 when he heard the singing. It was faint, unpolished, the voice of someone who had never trained as a singer and never intended to be heard, but there was something in it, some raw and unguarded tenderness, that stopped Nathaniel mid-step in the hallway. He edged closer to the doorway, and through the narrow gap where the door had been left slightly ajar, he saw his grandfather, the great Harold Whitfield, founder of an empire, feared and respected by boardrooms full of powerful men, lying small and fragile in a hospital bed, his hand held tightly in the hand of a woman in wrinkled blue scrubs, her badge still clipped to her collar even though, as Nathaniel would later learn, her shift had ended 3 hours earlier. She was singing an old jazz song, something about a summer evening and a love that never really left, and Harold's eyes were closed, his face slack with something Nathaniel had not seen on his grandfather's face in longer than he could remember, contentment. Nathaniel stood frozen in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a minute or two, watching a stranger give his grandfather something that he, the grandson, the only living family member who visited with any regularity, had never once thought to give him. It was not medicine. It was not money, though God knew Nathaniel had plenty of that to offer. It was simply presence. Simply time. Simply the decision, made quietly and without any expectation of reward, to stay a little longer than you had to notice a lonely old man's favorite song and play it for him, to hold a trembling hand until it stopped trembling quite so much. Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest, some old, calcified thing he had not realized he was carrying, and for a moment he was not a billionaire executive standing in a hospital hallway but simply a 9-year-old boy again, remembering how badly he had wanted someone, anyone, to sit with him after his parents' funeral and not leave when the polite amount of time had passed. He did not go in right away. Instead, he stepped back from the door and found a quiet corner of the waiting area down the hall, and he sat there, his mind churning, until the singing stopped and, some 20 minutes later, Margaret Ellery emerged from room 214, gently pulling the door closed behind her, her shoulders slumped with the particular exhaustion of someone who has given away more of herself than she technically had left to give. She startled slightly when she saw him sitting there, this tall man in an obviously expensive suit, his tie loosened, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested he had been crying, though he would have denied it if asked. "I'm sorry," she said, straightening her badge instinctively, the old reflex of a nurse worried she has been caught doing something wrong. "Visiting hours ended a while ago. I was finishing up some things with Mr. Whitfield." "You're not in trouble," Nathaniel said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he could not quite name. "I'm his grandson." "Nathaniel." Margaret's expression shifted, softening with recognition, though not the kind of starstruck recognition that so often greeted the Whitfield name. It was gentler than that, almost sympathetic. "Your grandfather talks about you," she said. "About the treehouse. About the way you used to build little towns out of blocks on the living room floor and tell him someday you'd build real ones." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He had not thought about the block towns in 25 years. He had not known his grandfather remembered them either. "He never told me that," he said quietly. "He doesn't tell most people much of anything," Margaret said, not unkindly. "I think he's afraid of being a burden. Old people get that way sometimes, especially the proud ones. They'd rather be alone than admit they need somebody." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, taking in the tired lines around her eyes, the coffee stain on the sleeve of her scrub top, the badge that read Margaret Ellery, RN, and something in him wanted very badly to understand this woman who had, apparently, given away 3 unpaid hours of her evening to sing lullabies to a stranger's grandfather. "Why do you stay?" he asked. "After your shift ends." "I saw the clock. You clocked out hours ago." Margaret shrugged, a small, tired movement, and for a moment Nathaniel thought she might simply brush the question off with some polite platitude about caring for patients, the kind of answer hospital administrators put on recruitment brochures. But instead she looked down the hallway toward room 214, and something genuine crossed her face. "Because he's scared," she said simply. "And because when I was 7 years old, my father was in a hospital bed very much like that one, dying of lung cancer, and my mother worked 2 jobs and couldn't be there most of the time, and there was a nurse, I never even learned her name, who used to sit with him in the evenings after her shift ended, just so he wouldn't be alone. I remember visiting him and seeing her there, holding his hand, and I remember thinking, even as a little girl, that I wanted to be exactly like her someday. So now, when I clock out and I know there's somebody in that wing who's more scared of being alone than they are of dying, I stay. It's not much. It's just time. But sometimes time is the only thing a person really needs, and it's the one thing none of us ever seem to have enough of to give away." Nathaniel did not sleep that night, not really. He lay in the enormous, silent master bedroom of his downtown penthouse, staring at the ceiling, replaying Margaret Ellery's words over and over, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, he found himself doing something he had not done in years. He cried, quietly, alone, for the grandfather who had built him an empire but never once, as far as Nathaniel could remember, simply sat with him and asked how he was doing, and for the version of himself who had grown up believing that love was something you provided for people through wealth and opportunity rather than something you gave through the simple, unglamorous act of staying. The following morning, Nathaniel canceled his flight to Chicago, where he was scheduled to give a keynote at an industry conference that his assistant had spent weeks arranging, and instead he drove to Fairview Memorial himself, without his usual driver, without his usual entourage of assistants trailing behind him with tablets and schedules. He found his grandfather awake, propped up against his pillows, looking small in the harsh fluorescent light of the morning, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Nathaniel pulled the vinyl chair up close to the bed and simply sat there, not checking his phone, not glancing at his watch, not thinking about the merger or the board meeting or the 11 unread emails marked urgent that his assistant had flagged. He sat, and he asked his grandfather about the treehouse, and Harold Whitfield's eyes filled with tears as he described, in halting sentences interrupted by his labored breathing, how he had built it in a single weekend because 9-year-old Nathaniel had asked for one and Harold had realized, with a jolt of guilt, that he had missed the boy's birthday 2 years running and did not know how to make up for it except by hammering wood together until his hands blistered. "I thought you hated me for all the years I wasn't there," Harold whispered, his papery voice barely audible over the soft hum of the hospital equipment. "I thought that was why you never called just to talk. Only ever about business." "I didn't know how," Nathaniel admitted, and it was perhaps the most honest sentence he had spoken in a decade. "I thought that's what you wanted from me. To be good at the business. I thought that was the only language we had left." They talked for nearly 3 hours that morning, longer than they had talked, uninterrupted and without an agenda, in 15 years, and when Nathaniel finally rose to leave, his grandfather gripped his hand with more strength than Nathaniel had seen from him in weeks and said, "Find that nurse. Margaret. Whatever this company owes anybody, it owes her more than we could ever put a number on. Don't let her walk out of here and disappear into the world like she doesn't matter, Nathaniel. People like her are the reason the rest of us are worth anything at all." Over the following weeks, something shifted in the rhythm of room 214, though the shift was subtle enough that most of the hospital staff did not notice it right away. Nathaniel began visiting nearly every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for most of the afternoon, and he began, almost without meaning to, timing his visits so that they would overlap with the end of Margaret's shift, so that he might catch a few minutes of conversation with her in the hallway or, more often, so that he might simply observe, quietly and with a growing sense of humility, the particular grace with which she moved through her work. He watched her kneel beside an elderly woman 2 doors down who had grown confused and frightened in the night, patiently explaining, for what must have been the 10th time that week, where she was and why, without a trace of impatience in her voice. He watched her remember, unprompted, that a patient's daughter was getting married that weekend and ask, with genuine warmth, how the dress fitting had gone. He watched her stay, again and again, past the end of her paid hours, not because anyone required it of her, but because some deep well of compassion inside her simply refused to let people sit alone with their fear. He learned, over the course of these observations and the occasional hallway conversation, that Margaret Ellery's own life was not an easy one. Her husband Walter had died 6 years earlier, leaving her with a mortgage she now paid alone on a nurse's salary that had not kept pace with the rising cost of the city. Her daughter Claire was a schoolteacher, herself struggling to make ends meet while raising a young son of her own, a boy named Oliver who called his grandmother every evening, without fail, to tell her about his day, because Margaret had made it clear to him from the time he could talk that being loved by someone did not require grand gestures, only the discipline of showing up, again and again, even when it was inconvenient. Margaret had, in fact, been quietly worried for months about whether she could continue affording her small apartment, having recently learned that her building was being sold to a developer who intended to raise the rent substantially, and she had been lying awake some nights doing the arithmetic of her savings and coming up short, wondering whether she would need to take on a second job at 54 years old, wondering whether her body, so faithfully devoted to the care of others for nearly 3 decades, had enough left in it to give. None of this Margaret ever mentioned to Nathaniel or to Harold, because it did not occur to her that her own struggles were relevant to the care she provided, or that anyone in room 214 needed the added weight of her worries on top of their own. But Nathaniel, who had spent his entire career learning to read the subtle signals people gave off when they were under financial strain, without meaning to notice it began noticing anyway, the same 3 cardigans rotating through her weekly wardrobe, the careful way she counted out change at the hospital cafeteria register, the exhaustion in her eyes that went beyond what even a demanding nursing shift could explain. It was Harold Whitfield, in the end, who forced the issue, on an afternoon in late autumn when his breathing had grown noticeably more labored and the doctors had begun using the careful, measured language that families learn to recognize as a warning that time is running short. He asked Nathaniel to close the door, and when they were alone, he said, in a voice weakened but resolute, "I want to see her before I go. Not to say goodbye. I want to do something for her, and I want to do it while I can still watch it happen, because God knows I spent most of my life doing things for people only after they could no longer see the good it did them." And so, on a bright, crisp Saturday morning in November, with golden autumn light pouring through the windows of room 214, Nathaniel Whitfield asked Margaret Ellery, who had come in on her day off simply to check on Harold because she could not bring herself to stay away, to sit down in the vinyl chair she had occupied so many nights before. Harold, propped up against his pillows with more color in his face than he had shown in weeks, asked Nathaniel to hand him a folder that had been resting on the bedside table, and with trembling hands, he passed it to Margaret himself. Inside the folder, Margaret found the deed to her apartment building, purchased outright by the Whitfield family 2 weeks earlier, along with a letter stating that her rent would remain frozen at its current rate for as long as she chose to live there, and that a trust had been established in her name, and in the names of her daughter Claire and her grandson Oliver, sufficient to cover Oliver's education through college and to allow Margaret, whenever she felt ready, to retire from the exhausting physical demands of nursing without a single worry about how she would pay her bills. But it was not the financial details that made Margaret's hands shake as she read, nor was it even the staggering generosity of the gesture itself. It was the handwritten note, in Harold Whitfield's shaky, uneven script, folded inside the folder, which read simply, "You held my hand when nobody was paying you to. You sang to a stranger when your own body was tired and your own life was hard and nobody would have blamed you for going home. I built an empire, and it bought me houses and airplanes and a name people whisper in boardrooms, but it never once bought me what you gave me for free. I am not trying to repay you, because what you gave cannot be repaid. I am only trying to make sure that a woman with a heart like yours never has to lie awake at night wondering how she'll keep a roof over her family's head. Thank you for teaching an old, tired man, in the last months of his life, that he was still worth loving, not for what he built, but simply for who he was underneath it all." Margaret Ellery, who had spent 29 years being the strong one in every room she entered, the calm presence who held everyone else together while they fell apart, sat in that vinyl chair and wept, openly and without embarrassment, while Harold Whitfield reached out with his trembling hand and Nathaniel Whitfield, the billionaire grandson who had once believed love was something you provided through wealth alone, knelt beside her chair and simply stayed, because he had finally learned, at 36 years old, in a hospital room full of autumn light, that staying was the whole point, that it always had been. Before we continue toward the end of this story, we would love to hear from you in the comments. Has there ever been a moment in your life when someone's simple act of kindness, something small and quiet and unnoticed by the rest of the world, changed the entire direction of your path? We read every single comment, and we believe that sharing these moments with each other is exactly how hope spreads from one heart to another. Harold Whitfield passed away 11 days later, on a quiet Tuesday morning with soft winter light beginning to creep through the blinds, and he did not die alone. Nathaniel was there, holding one of his hands, and Margaret Ellery, who had come in an hour before her shift officially began because something in her had known, with the particular instinct nurses develop after decades of sitting with the dying, that today would be the day, held the other. The old jazz song played softly from a small speaker Nathaniel had brought in weeks earlier, and Harold Whitfield's last words, spoken so quietly that both Nathaniel and Margaret had to lean in close to hear them, were, "Thank you for staying." Nobody in that room was entirely certain whether he was speaking to his grandson, to his nurse, or to both of them at once, and in the end, it did not matter, because the message was the same regardless of who received it, that a life well lived is not measured by the empire a person builds, but by the people who choose, freely and without obligation, to sit beside you when the building is done and all that remains is the simple, terrifying, beautiful business of being human. The funeral was, by necessity, a large affair, attended by senators and business leaders and reporters who wanted a quote about the passing of an American business icon, but Nathaniel, standing at the podium in a church filled with people who had known his grandfather's name but not his heart, chose not to speak about the shipping empire or the stock prices or the buildings that bore the Whitfield name across the city skyline. Instead, he spoke about a treehouse, and about a jazz song, and about a nurse named Margaret Ellery who had taught both grandfather and grandson, in the final months of an old man's life, what it truly meant to be loved for who you are rather than for what you have accomplished. He spoke about how his grandfather had spent 80 years believing that his worth was measured in the size of the empire he built, only to discover, in the last months of his life, that the only thing he actually wanted was for someone to stay a little longer than they had to notice his favorite song, to hold his hand without being paid or obligated to do so. And he made a promise, standing at that podium in front of hundreds of people who had come expecting to hear about a business legacy, that the Whitfield Foundation, which had until that point existed mostly as a tax strategy with an occasional charitable gala attached to it, would be reorganized entirely around a single mission: funding scholarships, wage support, and mental health resources for nurses and caregivers across the country, the people who, as his grandfather had come to understand, far too late in his life, hold together the most fragile and frightening moments of human existence for wages that rarely reflect the enormity of what they give. Margaret Ellery continued working at Fairview Memorial for another 2 years after Harold Whitfield's passing, not because she needed the money any longer, but because she discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that the financial security the Whitfield family had given her did not diminish her love for the work itself. If anything, it freed her to do the work more fully, without the low hum of financial anxiety that had quietly shaped her decisions for years. She spent less time worrying about overtime pay and more time simply present with her patients, and the hospital, in a decision that surprised absolutely no one who knew her, eventually named her Employee of the Year, an honor she accepted with the same quiet, unassuming grace with which she had once sat beside a dying billionaire and sung him a song about a summer evening long past. When she finally did retire, at 56, it was not because her body had given out but because she wanted, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, to have enough energy left at the end of the day to attend her grandson Oliver's baseball games, to sit on the porch of her paid-for apartment with her daughter Claire on Sunday afternoons, and to simply exist, unhurried, in a life that no longer required her to give away every last ounce of herself just to keep the lights on. Nathaniel Whitfield, for his part, became a changed man, though the change did not happen all at once, in the dramatic, cinematic way that such changes sometimes happen in stories. It happened slowly, in 1,000 small decisions made over the following years, in the way he began scheduling his calendar to include actual, protected time with the people he loved rather than treating relationships as tasks to be squeezed in around business obligations, in the way he made a habit, every single week, of visiting Fairview Memorial's geriatric wing, Not because his grandfather was there any longer, but because he had come to understand that there were dozens of other Harold Whitfields in that wing, lonely and frightened and convinced that their worth had expired along with their usefulness, and that simply sitting with them, asking about their treehouses and their jazz songs and the small, ordinary details of the lives they had lived, was some of the most important work he could possibly do with the privilege he had been given. He eventually married, some years later, a woman named Josephine who worked as a hospice chaplain and who understood, in her own quiet way, exactly the lesson Nathaniel had learned in room 214, and together they raised their children with a rule that Nathaniel insisted upon above all others in their household, that no amount of money or success would ever excuse them from the discipline of staying, of showing up, of holding someone's hand a little longer than was strictly required. If this story has touched something in you today, if it has reminded you of someone who stayed a little longer than they had to, who held your hand when nobody was paying them to, who taught you that love is not measured in grand gestures but in the quiet, faithful accumulation of small ones, we would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing what this story meant to you. Share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story like this one. Our community grows stronger every single time one of you chooses to pass a little kindness along, and it is our deepest honor to keep bringing you stories that remind us all of what truly matters. Years later, long after Harold Whitfield's name had faded from the covers of business magazines and settled instead into the quieter, more permanent legacy of the foundation that bore his name, Margaret Ellery kept a single photograph on the small table beside her reading chair, a photograph taken on that golden autumn morning in room 214, the three of them together, an old man, his grandson, and the nurse who had stayed after her shift for no reason at all except that her heart would not let her leave. She would sometimes look at that photograph in the quiet hours of the evening, when Oliver had gone home and the apartment was still, and she would think about all the countless nights she had almost decided not to stay, all the evenings when her feet ached too badly and her own bed called to her too loudly, and she would feel, not pride exactly, but something quieter and more durable than pride, the simple, settled knowledge that she had spent her life doing the one thing that mattered most, which was showing up for people when they needed her, without asking what it would cost her or what she might get in return. And she would think, too, about the strange and beautiful way the world sometimes works, how an act of kindness offered freely, with no expectation of reward, had rippled outward to change not only her own life and her family's future, but the entire trajectory of a company, a foundation, and a grandson who had once believed that love could be purchased and had learned, in the end, that it could only ever be given. That, perhaps, is the truest lesson of Harold Whitfield's life and of Margaret Ellery's quiet, unglamorous devotion, that the world does not remember us for what we accumulate, but for who we chose to sit beside when the accumulating was done. It does not ask how large an empire we built, but whether we noticed the people around us who were frightened and alone, and whether we were willing, even when nobody was watching and nobody was paying us and nothing in the job description required it of us, to stay just a little longer, to hold on just a little tighter, to remind another human being, in whatever small way we could, that they still mattered. Somewhere in this world tonight, there is very likely someone lying in a bed much like the one in room 214, wondering whether anyone will come, whether anyone will stay, whether the life they lived meant anything at all to the people around them. And if this story has done anything at all, we hope it has reminded you that you have the power, in ways both small and enormous, to be the answer to that fear, simply by choosing, again and again, to stay.